The Texas sun hadn't yet broken over the horizon when Jack Dawson heard the sound. Not the usual pre-dawn chorus of cattle or the whisper of wind through dry grass, but something different. Something human. He'd been up since 4, as always, checking fence lines on the eastern edge of his property where the land turned wild and unforgiving. At 40 years old, Jack had learned to trust his instincts, and right now every nerve in his body told him something was wrong. He found her collapsed near a cluster of mesquite trees, her dark hair matted with dust and sweat, her Apache dress torn and faded. She wasn't moving. Jack's first thought was to ride away. Getting involved with Apache matters could bring trouble he couldn't afford. But as he dismounted, he saw her chest rise and fall, shallow and desperate. She was alive, barely. Her lips were cracked from dehydration, her skin burning with fever. He knelt beside her, and her eyes fluttered open for just a moment. They were deep brown, filled with something between terror and defiance. Jack made his decision in seconds. He lifted her carefully onto his horse, feeling how light she was, how fragile despite the strength he could sense beneath her exhaustion. The ride back to his ranch took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. His small wooden house appeared modest against the vast Texas landscape, weathered planks, a sagging porch, windows that needed repair. It wasn't much, but it was all he had left after years of drought and debt. Inside, he laid her on his own bed, the only one in the house. He fetched water from the well, cool and clean, and pressed a damp cloth to her forehead. She stirred again, and this time her eyes focused on him. There was no trust there, only wariness. Jack understood. He'd look the same way if their positions were reversed. He offered her water, and after a long moment, she accepted, drinking slowly, carefully. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them like the endless prairie outside, full of questions neither was ready to ask. But something had shifted. Jack Dawson, who'd sworn off caring about anything beyond his cattle and his land, suddenly found himself responsible for someone else's life. And as the morning light finally broke through his dusty windows, he wondered what he'd just brought into his world. 3 days passed before she could stand without swaying. Jack learned her name was Ayanna, though she offered little else. She moved around his small house like a ghost, watching him with those intense eyes, studying every movement he made. Jack gave her space, understanding that trust couldn't be forced. He kept to his routine, feeding cattle, repairing fences, avoiding the town where Howard Mitchell's influence spread like poison through every conversation and every business deal. Mitchell owned half the county and wanted the other half, including Jack's ranch. The debt hung over Jack like a storm cloud, payments he could barely make, interest that climbed higher each month. But he pushed those thoughts aside when he returned each evening to find Ayanna had cleaned his house, organized his chaotic kitchen, even started preparing simple meals with the sparse supplies he kept. She worked silently, never asking permission, simply doing what needed to be done. On the 4th evening, as the Texas sky turned orange and purple, Jack found her standing on his porch, looking out toward the east where her people's territory began. He approached carefully, keeping distance between them. The evening air was cooling, a relief after another scorching day. For the first time, she spoke more than single words. Her English was careful, deliberate, learned from missionaries, but shaped by her own tongue. She told him she'd been running from an arrangement her uncle made, a marriage to a man twice her age from another band, a man she'd never chosen and didn't love. She refused, and in her community, that refusal carried consequences she couldn't face. Jack listened without judgment, understanding more than she might expect. He knew about obligations that felt like chains, about expectations that crushed personal desires. His own family had planned his life before he was old enough to have opinions. This ranch, a wife chosen for land connections, children to carry on a legacy. Most of it had crumbled years ago, leaving him with just the land and more loneliness than any man should carry. He told her she could stay as long as she needed, that he wouldn't force her to return to anything she was running from. Ayanna turned to him then, really look at him,
and something passed between them. Not romantic, not yet, but recognition. Two people who understood what it meant to fight for the right to choose their own path. That night she smiled at him for the first time, small and cautious, but genuine. And Jack realized his quiet, predictable life was about to become far more complicated. The days developed a rhythm. Jack woke before dawn, and Ayanna was already awake preparing coffee in the battered pot he'd used alone for years. She'd learned how he liked it, strong and black, no sugar. He taught her about the ranch work, surprised to discover she understood animals instinctively, calming nervous cattle with soft words in her own language and patient gestures. She taught him Apache words in return, laughing softly when he mangled the pronunciation, her face transforming when she smiled. The townspeople started noticing. His trips to the general store became less frequent, and when he did come, he bought different supplies, cloth, needles, things a bachelor wouldn't normally need. Old Mrs. Henderson at the mercantile asked pointed questions Jack deflected with practiced ease. He knew what they'd think, what they'd say. In 1835 Texas, a white rancher harboring an Apache woman was scandal enough to destroy whatever remained of his already damaged reputation. But Jack discovered he cared less about their opinions than he expected. Mitchell's men rode by twice that week, ostensibly checking property lines, but Jack knew they were watching. Mitchell had been pressuring him to sell for months, making thinly veiled threats about calling in the debt early. The ranch was barely profitable, but it was Jack's last connection to his father, his grandfather, the life he'd been born into. Losing it would mean losing himself, but keeping it meant making payments he couldn't afford unless this year's cattle sale went perfectly. One afternoon, as they worked together mending a section of fence, Ayanna asked him about his life, his past. Jack found himself talking more than he had in years, telling him about his parents who died within months of each other 5 years back, about the woman he'd almost married who chose a richer man instead, about the slow decay of everything he'd tried to build. Ayanna listened with complete attention, never interrupting, never offering empty comfort. When he finished, she simply placed her hand over his for a moment, warm and solid and real. It was the first time she'd voluntarily touched him, and the contact sent electricity through his exhausted heart. That evening she sang while preparing dinner, a low, haunting Apache melody that filled his small house with something it had lacked for long too, life. Jack sat on his porch steps listening and realized he'd been merely existing for years, not living. Ayanna was teaching him the difference, and he was terrified of how much he was beginning to need that lesson. The trouble started on a Saturday. Jack had gone into town for supplies, leaving Ayanna at the ranch. She'd insisted she'd be fine, that she could handle any work that came up. He should have known better. When he returned in late afternoon, he found Mitchell's son, Cole, and 2 ranch hands standing in his yard, their horses tied near his porch. Ayanna stood on the porch steps, her posture rigid, her face carefully neutral, but Jack could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands were clenched. Cole Mitchell was 25, arrogant and used to getting whatever he wanted. He turned as Jack approached, a smirk playing on his young face. The conversation was brief and ugly. Cole suggested that if Jack was entertaining Indians, perhaps he wasn't fit to maintain property in decent society. Perhaps his father should accelerate the loan repayment schedule. The bank might be interested to know about Jack's unusual living arrangements. The threats were barely disguised, the implications clear. Cole's eyes kept drifting to Ayanna with an expression that made Jack's blood boil. Jack kept his voice level, calm, though fury burned in his chest. He told Cole to leave his property and not return. Cole laughed, mounted his horse, and delivered a parting shot. His father expected the next payment in 2 weeks, and it better be on time, or they'll be having a different conversation. As they rode away, Jack turned to Ayanna, asking if they'd touched her, threatened her. She shook her head, but he could see the fear she was trying to hide. She'd dealt with men like Cole before, men who saw her as something less than human, something they could discard or abuse without consequences. That night they sat together in the growing darkness, the lantern light casting shadows across his small living room. Ayanna broke the silence first, saying maybe she should leave, that she was bringing trouble he didn't need. Jack surprised himself with the vehemence of his response. She wasn't going anywhere unless she wanted to, and if Mitchell wanted to fight over his property or his choices, he'd get one. He'd lost too much in his life by staying silent, by accepting what others told him he should do. He wasn't losing this, too. Ayanna looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and something deeper, something neither of them was ready to name. She moved closer on the worn couch they shared, and Jack felt the space between them charged with possibility. He reached for her hand, holding it between both of hers, and spoke softly. She told him he was different from what she'd expected,